My name is Victoria Chin, and at 32, I never imagined Christmas dinner would become the most satisfying moment of my life. Sitting at my in-laws' mahogany dining table, surrounded by crystal glasses and family portraits that didn't include me, I watched my husband Marcus nervously adjust his tie. He knew what was coming. We both did. The annual tradition of his mother, Patricia Blackwood, finding new ways to remind me that I didn't belong in their world of old money and older prejudices. But this Christmas would be different. This Christmas the truth would finally come out. Before I tell you exactly how their perfectly orchestrated family dinner turned into the most uncomfortable meal of their privileged lives, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. If you've ever been underestimated because of where you come from or what you look like, this story is for you. Hit that like button because trust me, the revenge in this story is sweeter than Patricia's famous Christmas pudding. I met Marcus 3 years ago at a tech conference in San Francisco. I was there representing the venture capital firm where I worked as a senior analyst, and he was presenting his startup's latest product. What caught my attention wasn't his pitch, though it was solid, but the way he actually listened when I asked technical questions, unlike most entrepreneurs who assumed I was someone's assistant. "You really know your stuff," he said afterward, genuine surprise in his voice. I have an MBA from Wharton and 7 years in venture capital," I replied, handing him my business card. "Victoria Chin and Associates." His eyes widened as he read the card. Chin and Associates wasn't just any firm. We managed over $2 billion in assets and had a reputation for finding the next big thing before anyone else noticed. What he didn't know then, and what his family still didn't know now, was that I wasn't just an employee. I was the Chin and Associates. Our courtship was refreshingly normal. Marcus was kind, intelligent, and driven. Qualities I valued far more than his family's wealth, though I had plenty of my own. He told me about his family gradually, painting them as traditional but loving. His father, Robert, was a retired investment banker. His mother, Patricia, dedicated her life to charity work and maintaining the family's social standing. His sister, Caroline, worked in art curation and lived off her trust fund. "They can be a bit formal," Marcus warned me before our first meeting. "Old East Coast money comes with certain expectations." I understood. I'd grown up in San Francisco's Chinatown, where my parents ran a small import business. Through scholarships, hard work, and strategic investments, I'd built something they couldn't comprehend. Wealth that didn't come with a pedigree or a family crest. The first dinner at the Blackwood estate was exactly what I expected. The Georgian mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, screamed old money from its marble foyer to its oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors. Patricia greeted me with the kind of smile society matrons perfect in finishing school. Warm on the surface, calculating underneath. "Victoria, how lovely," she said, air-kissing near my cheek. "Marcus tells us you work in finance?" The slight pause before finance was deliberate, as if my career was a hobby I'd eventually outgrow once I secured my real goal, marriage into their family. During dinner, the questions came disguised as polite conversation. Where did I go to school? Wharton, but they somehow missed that detail. What did my parents do? Import business, which they interpreted as shop owners. How did I afford my apartment in the financial district? Investment portfolio, though they assumed Marcus was helping with rent. Caroline, blonde and sharp-tongued like her mother, was more direct. "It must be nice dating someone so established," she said, swirling her wine. "Takes the pressure off, doesn't it?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "Caroline." "What?" "I'm just saying it's practical. Victoria's obviously very smart." The backhanded compliment hung in the air like expensive perfume, cloying and impossible to ignore. But I smiled and complimented Caroline's vintage Cartier bracelet, watching her preen at the recognition of her good taste. That night, Marcus apologized profusely. "They'll warm up to you," he promised. "They just need time." 2 years later, when Marcus proposed with his grandmother's engagement ring, a stunning Art Deco piece worth more than most people's cars, I realized they had no intention of warming up to me. The ring came with a lecture from Patricia about family traditions and maintaining certain standards. The wedding planning was a masterclass in subtle exclusion, with Patricia making decisions and then informing me of them later. "We've booked the club for the reception," she announced during one planning session. "It's where all the Blackwood weddings have been held." I thought we discussed the botanical gardens, I said calmly. Oh dear, that's far too public. The club is much more appropriate for our family. Our family. Never your wedding, or Victoria and Marcus's celebration. Always their family, their traditions, their standards. The wedding was beautiful and cold, like a museum exhibit on how proper families celebrate. My parents, proud and slightly overwhelmed, were seated at a back table with distant cousins and college friends. Patricia's friends occupied the prime real estate near the head table, where they could properly observe and judge the proceedings. During the reception, I overheard Patricia explaining my background to the garden club president. She's quite accomplished, actually. Works at some investment firm. Not quite our world, but Marcus is happy. Not quite our world. The phrase that would define the next year of my marriage. After the wedding, the subtle campaign to remind me of my place intensified. Family gatherings included casual mentions of ex-girlfriends who were more suitable. Charity events featured introductions that somehow never mentioned my actual job title. Holiday gifts were carefully chosen to reflect what they thought I could afford to reciprocate. Nice enough to seem generous, expensive enough to make me feel inadequate. Marcus, caught between his family and his wife, tried to maintain peace by minimizing the conflicts. "You know how my mother is," became his standard response to my frustrations. "She means well." But I wasn't naive. I recognized a long-term strategy when I saw one. They were betting that eventually the constant pressure would either break me or break us. What they didn't understand was that I'd been underestimated my entire life, and I'd turned it into a competitive advantage. The breaking point came last Christmas, exactly 1 year after our wedding. We were staying at the family estate for the holidays, a tradition I'd learned was non-negotiable. The house was decorated like a magazine spread. Garland on every banister, wreaths on every door, and a 12-foot tree in the living room that required a ladder to reach the top. Christmas Eve dinner was an elaborate affair with Patricia's signature prime rib, multiple wine courses, and enough crystal to stock a small store. The guest list included family friends, business associates, and several unmarried daughters of Patricia's contemporaries. A not-so-subtle reminder that Marcus had other options. Caroline had brought her newest boyfriend, a hedge fund manager named Preston who spoke in financial jargon and name-dropped his Harvard connections every few minutes. The conversation inevitably turned to business and investments, with Robert holding court about his glory days on Wall Street. "The problem with today's market," Robert pontificated, "is that everyone thinks they're an investor. Young people especially, they see one success story and think they know something about wealth management." Preston nodded enthusiastically. "Absolutely. Real wealth requires experience, connections, generational knowledge. It's not something you can just learn." I felt Marcus tense beside me, recognizing the subtle dig. Caroline smirked from across the table, while Patricia maintained her serene hostess expression. "Of course, some people are natural investors," Preston continued, warming to his theme. "Marcus, for instance, has excellent instincts. That trust fund your grandmother set up is performing beautifully." Marcus nearly choked on his wine. "Preston. What? It's not a secret. Family money, properly managed, is the foundation of real security. Not like these new money types who get lucky with tech stocks and think they're financial geniuses." The room fell silent except for the crackling fireplace. Everyone knew exactly who Preston was referring to, and it wasn't subtle. I could feel the expectation in the air. Would I defend myself, make a scene, prove their point about my unsuitability? Instead, I smiled and took a sip of my wine. Patricia, emboldened by my silence, decided to twist the knife. "Well, not everyone can be born into the right circumstances," she said with false sympathy. "We all work with what we have." Caroline laughed, a tinkling sound like breaking glass. "Some people are just more practical about their choices." "Meaning?" Marcus asked, his voice warning. "Oh, come on," Caroline waved her hand dismissively. "Everyone knows why people marry into established families. It's not exactly a secret." The accusation hung in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. Gold digger. The word they'd all been thinking for 3 years but never quite said aloud. Patricia set down her wine glass with deliberate precision. "Caroline has a point. Some people marry for love, others for opportunity. There's no shame in being practical." "Mother," Marcus started, but she held up a perfectly manicured hand. Let me finish, dear. Victoria is obviously intelligent. She saw an opportunity and took it. That's admirable in its way. But let's not pretend this marriage is about anything other than financial security. The room was completely silent now. Even the fire seemed to have stopped crackling. Robert cleared his throat uncomfortably, while Preston looked like he was watching a tennis match, his head swiveling between participants. She's just a gold digger, Patricia announced, her voice carrying the finality of a judge's verdict. Marrying for money. We all know it, even if we're too polite to say it. I smiled and said, actually, I'm the one who set up his trust fund. The champagne glasses stopped clinking. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Even the grandfather clock in the corner seemed to have frozen in time. I'm sorry. Patricia's composure cracked just slightly. I reached for my purse. A vintage Hermes that Patricia had once commented was a good replica, and pulled out a leather portfolio. I said, I'm the one who set up Marcus's trust fund. Would you like to see the paperwork? Marcus stared at me with a mixture of shock and dawning realization. He'd never asked detailed questions about his trust fund, assuming it was another family arrangement he didn't need to understand. I opened the portfolio and laid out the documents on Patricia's pristine white tablecloth. Trust agreements, investment statements, and incorporation papers. All bearing the seal of Chin and Associates and my signature as the managing partner. The Blackwood Family Trust, I read aloud, established January 15, 2019, with an initial investment of $5.2 million, currently valued at $8.7 million thanks to strategic investments in emerging technologies and cryptocurrency. Robert leaned forward, his face pale. That's impossible. Our family attorney referred you to Chin and Associates when you needed someone to restructure Marcus's inheritance for tax purposes, I continued. I handled the entire transaction personally, though I worked under my associate's name to avoid any appearance of conflict of interest once Marcus and I started dating. I pulled out another set of documents. These are the quarterly reports I've been sending to your family attorney. Performance summaries, investment strategies, projected growth. I've been managing your son's money for 4 years and quite successfully, I might add. Caroline's mouth opened and closed like a fish. But, you work for someone else. I work for myself. Chin and Associates is my firm. I founded it 8 years ago with $500,000 of my own money I made day trading while I was getting my MBA. I smiled at her shocked expression. That replica Hermes bag you mentioned? I bought it with my first million. Preston, ever the hedge fund manager, was the first to recover. Wait, you're saying you manage the Blackwood Trust? The one that's been outperforming the S&P by 12% annually. 14% actually, if you count the cryptocurrency positions I established in 2020. The silence stretched on. I could hear Patricia's careful breathing, Robert's nervous finger tapping, and somewhere in the distance, the kitchen staff cleaning up from dinner service. Marcus found his voice first. Victoria, why didn't you tell me? I tried to keep our personal and professional lives separate. Your family hired me before we met, and I thought it might be awkward if you knew I was managing your money while we were dating. But after we got married, your family made it very clear that they thought I was only interested in your money. It seemed like telling them I was already managing it might complicate things. Patricia finally managed to speak. You can't be serious. I pulled out my phone and showed her the Chin and Associates website, with my photo prominently displayed as founder and CEO. Then I scrolled to our client testimonials, where the Blackwood family attorney had written a glowing review of our innovative strategies and exceptional returns. Your attorney has been recommending us to his other clients for 3 years, I said. We currently manage over $2 billion in assets for families just like yours. The truth was sinking in, and I could see the calculations happening behind their eyes. All this time they'd been treating me like some opportunistic outsider while I was quietly making them money. A lot of money. Robert cleared his throat. The Christmas bonus, the one that paid for Caroline's new car, came from the cryptocurrency profits I generated last quarter, I confirmed. I've been reinvesting the gains to diversify the portfolio, but your attorney suggested distributing some of the profits for tax purposes. Caroline, who had been silent since the revelation began, finally found her voice. So when you complimented my Cartier bracelet at that first dinner, I was being polite. I own the same one in 3 different metals. Preston, apparently unable to help himself, blurted out, "What's your net worth?" Marcus shot him a look, but I answered anyway. "Personal assets or firm assets?" "Personal. Around $47 million, give or take a few million depending on market fluctuations." The number hung in the air like a challenge. To put it in perspective, the Blackwood family's total wealth, including their house, investments and Marcus's trust fund, was approximately $15 million. I wasn't just rich. I was significantly richer than they were. Patricia's wine glass trembled slightly in her hand. "But, your parents, the import business, is worth about $12 million now. I helped them expand into online retail 5 years ago. They were nervous about the investment, but I guaranteed the loan personally." I smiled at the memory. "They're actually thinking about retiring to that house they bought in Napa. The one with the view of the valley." The evening that had started with subtle insults about my background had turned into a financial disclosure that reframed every interaction we'd ever had. Every time they talked down to me, every assumption about my motives, every carefully worded insult, all of it had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of who I was and what I brought to their family. Marcus was staring at me like he was seeing me for the first time. "Victoria, I had no idea." "I know. And I should have told you sooner. But honestly..." I looked around the table at their shocked faces. "I was curious to see how long this would go on. How long your family would keep treating me like some kind of opportunist while I was quietly making them wealthier than they'd ever been." Robert found his voice. "The advisory fees. How much have we been paying you?" 2% annually on managed assets. Standard rate for high net worth clients." I pulled out my calculator app. "On an $8.7 million portfolio, that's about $174,000 per year. But considering I've grown your initial investment by 67% in 4 years, I'd say you've gotten excellent value." The math was brutal and undeniable. Not only had they been wrong about my motivations, but they'd been paying me handsomely for the privilege of being wrong. Caroline, who had built her entire identity around having more than others, looked like she was going to be sick. "So when you said you couldn't afford the charity gala table last year..." I said I hadn't budgeted for it. There's a difference. I prefer to research charities thoroughly before making large donations. Unlike some people, I don't give money just to be seen giving money. It was a direct hit and Caroline flinched. Her charity work was entirely performative, all about the social aspects and none about the actual causes. Patricia, meanwhile, was going through what looked like all 5 stages of grief simultaneously. "But the wedding, you let us pay for everything. You insisted on paying for everything. Every time I offered to contribute, you said it was family tradition for the bride's family to handle the flowers and the groom's family to handle the venue. I wrote a check for $50,000 to cover my parents' portion and offered to pay for the honeymoon. You declined." Marcus looked confused. "I thought your parents paid for the flowers." "I reimbursed them that night. They were nervous about the expense, but I didn't want to embarrass them by insisting on paying directly." The true scope of the misunderstanding was becoming clear. While they'd been plotting to make me feel inferior, I'd been quietly managing their money and protecting my parents' dignity. Every slight, every subtle insult, every assumption had been not just wrong but spectacularly wrong. Preston, still fixated on the financial implications, leaned forward. "What about the prenup? Did you sign one?" The question was incredibly rude, but it cut to the heart of what everyone was thinking. Patricia perked up slightly. Surely they'd protected themselves with legal documentation. Marcus answered before I could. "We didn't sign a prenup. Victoria said she didn't need one." "Because I didn't," I added. "My assets are in a family trust that predates our marriage. Marcus couldn't touch them even if he wanted to." I paused for effect. "But if we divorced, he'd lose access to his trust fund management. I suppose he'd have to find another investment advisor." The implication was clear. I held all the cards and I always had. Robert, ever the practical businessman, was the first to grasp the full situation. "So you're saying, this entire time, you've been managing your family's money while your family questioned my motives for marrying your son?" "Yes." I closed the portfolio and slipped it back into my purse. "It's been an interesting 3 years." The silence that followed was different from the earlier shock. This was the silence of people recalculating everything they thought they knew, realizing that every assumption had been not just wrong but embarrassingly wrong. Marcus reached for my hand under the table. I'm so sorry, Victoria. I should have defended you more. I should have told them. Told them what? You didn't know either. I squeezed his hand. But you never treated me like they did. You never questioned my motives or made me feel like I didn't belong. It was true. Marcus had his flaws, but he'd never been calculating or cruel like his family. He'd simply been raised in a world where certain assumptions went unquestioned. Patricia was still processing, her perfect hostess facade cracking visibly. All those times when you said I wasn't quite your world. When you suggested I was marrying for money. When you seated my parents at the back of the reception. I kept my voice level, professional. I remember. Caroline buried her face in her hands. Oh God, the Hermes comment. Among others. The grandfather clock chimed 10 times, marking the official end of what was supposed to be a pleasant family Christmas Eve dinner. Instead, it had become a reckoning 3 years in the making. Preston, apparently incapable of reading the room, asked, "So what happens now? Do you fire them as clients?" It was Marcus who answered, his voice firm. "That's enough, Preston. This is a family matter." But I was curious about the same thing. What did happen now? I'd spent 3 years being quietly insulted while professionally managing their money. The situation was unprecedented in my experience. "I don't fire clients for personal reasons," I said finally. "Your portfolio is performing well and I have a fiduciary responsibility to maintain that performance regardless of other circumstances." Robert nodded slowly. "That's very professional of you." "I am a professional. I always have been." The evening concluded with the kind of awkward politeness that follows a social disaster. Gifts were exchanged with forced smiles and minimal conversation. Patricia's famous Christmas pudding sat largely untouched as everyone found reasons to retire early. In our bedroom that night, Marcus sat on the edge of the bed with his head in his hands. "I feel like I don't know anything anymore." I sat beside him, still wearing the pearl necklace my parents had given me for Christmas. Real pearls, cultured in Japan, worth more than Caroline's car. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. How long have you been? Why didn't you tell me?" So I told him. About starting with $500,000 in savings and turning it into millions through careful investments and strategic risks. About building a client base through referrals and reputation rather than family connections. About the satisfaction of being recognized for expertise rather than background. When your family hired me, I was already successful. When we met, I was already wealthy. When we married, I was already established in ways they never bothered to discover. Marcus was quiet for a long time. "I failed you," he said finally. "I let them treat you that way for 3 years. You couldn't defend against accusations you didn't know were being made. But I could see how they treated you. I knew it was wrong and I chose peace over protection." It was the most honest thing he'd said in months and I respected him for it. "What would you have done differently?" "I would have told them about your success from the beginning. I would have corrected their assumptions instead of letting them fester. I would have made it clear that you didn't need our money, you were already making it. And now." He really looked at me for the first time in our marriage. "Now I understand why you never seemed intimidated by them. You were never the one at a disadvantage." The next morning, Christmas Day, began with an awkward family breakfast. Patricia had clearly been up all night, probably researching Chin and Associates and confirming that everything I'd told them was true. Her usual confident demeanor was replaced by nervous energy and overcompensation. "Victoria, dear, would you like more coffee?" she asked for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. "I'm fine, thank you." Robert attempted normal conversation about the weather and local news, but everyone was thinking about the elephant in the room. Caroline remained mostly silent, picking at her eggs Benedict and avoiding eye contact. It was Marcus who finally addressed the situation directly. "I think we need to talk about last night." Patricia's coffee cup rattled against its saucer. "I'm not sure what there is to discuss." "There's plenty to discuss," Marcus said firmly. "Starting with an apology." "Marcus, really, there's no need," I began, but he held up a hand. "There's absolutely a need. My family has spent 3 years treating my wife like she was some kind of opportunist, while she was quietly making us money and keeping her own success private out of discretion. That requires acknowledgement. Robert cleared his throat. We may have misunderstood the situation. You deliberately chose to misunderstand the situation, Marcus corrected. You made assumptions based on prejudice and never bothered to verify them. Caroline finally spoke up. We didn't know. You didn't want to know, Marcus interrupted. You were more comfortable believing Victoria was beneath us than considering she might be our equal or better. The conversation that followed was long overdue. For the first time in 3 years, the family dynamics were honest rather than hidden behind polite society manners. Patricia admitted she'd felt threatened by my confidence and had responded by trying to diminish me. Caroline confessed she'd been jealous of my education and career. Robert acknowledged he'd made assumptions based on outdated prejudices about race and class. It wasn't a complete transformation. Years of ingrained attitudes don't change overnight. But it was a beginning. The most significant change came in Marcus himself. That morning he called his family attorney and requested a meeting to discuss his trust fund management. He wanted to understand his finances better and be more involved in the decision-making process. I've been passive about my own money for too long, he told me as we walked through the gardens behind the house. I want to learn from you, not just benefit from your expertise. It was the conversation we should have had 3 years earlier. Over the following months, our relationship underwent a fundamental shift. Marcus enrolled in investment courses and started attending industry conferences. He didn't try to become an expert overnight, but he engaged with the subject seriously for the first time in his life. More importantly, he began standing up to his family when they slipped back into old patterns. When Patricia made a subtle comment about my different background during Easter dinner, Marcus immediately corrected her. When Caroline suggested I was lucky to have found success so young, he pointed out that luck had nothing to do with years of hard work and strategic thinking. The family dynamics changed too, though more slowly. Patricia began asking my opinion on her own investments and eventually hired Chin and Associates to manage her personal portfolio. Caroline started taking business courses and launched a legitimate art consulting business rather than living entirely off her trust fund. But the most satisfying change was in how they introduced me to others. No more vague references to my working in finance, or being quite accomplished actually. Patricia began telling people I was the founder of Chin and Associates, and Robert would mention our firm's performance when discussing investment strategies with his golf partners. 1 year after that Christmas dinner revelation, we hosted the family gathering at our new home, a contemporary house in Marin County with views of the San Francisco Bay. As I watched Patricia help my mother arrange flowers while Caroline discussed business school applications with my father, I realized the evening had become what it should have been all along. A meeting of equals rather than a performance of hierarchy. Marcus found me on the deck, watching the sunset paint the bay in shades of gold and crimson. Any regrets? He asked, slipping his arm around my waist. About waiting 3 years to tell them the truth? About any of it. I considered the question seriously. The 3 years of subtle insults and careful exclusion had been painful, but they'd also taught me something valuable about the difference between respect and recognition. His family had eventually learned to respect my success, but they'd never truly recognized my worth as a person until they understood my financial value. No regrets, I said finally. Sometimes people need to be shocked into seeing clearly. And now we build something better. That Christmas, as we sat around our own dining table sharing stories and laughter with both families, I reflected on the journey that had brought us here. The woman who had been called a gold digger was indeed involved with gold. She was making it, managing it, and multiplying it for the very people who had questioned her motives. The irony wasn't lost on me. They'd accused me of marrying for money while I was the one with money. They'd suggested I was beneath their standards while I was exceeding their expectations. They'd worried I would take advantage of their son while I was taking care of their assets. But more than the financial vindication, I'd gained something more valuable. A husband who finally understood who he'd married, and a family who learned that worth isn't determined by pedigree, it's demonstrated by action. As Marcus raised his glass to toast new traditions and old values, I thought about all the assumptions that had been shattered that Christmas Eve night. Sometimes the most satisfying revenge isn't revenge at all. It's simply letting the truth speak for itself. The champagne glasses clinked again, but this time they didn't stop.